So we are hitting at 9:30, and I'm going to begin the session here. We'll give everyone else a couple of minutes to join. Great to see a few of you in the chat here. I know for at least one of you it is still the middle of the night, so thank you for joining, Dan. My name is Chris Phillips. I'm here from IBM, and I've been asked to come and talk to you about how to govern a large API estate, or more actually the mistakes I've seen people make. Now, what I'm going to put forward and propose is everything what people know, but it's more the consequences of not doing this is the key thing that I like to cover. And so I've got quite a lot to cover, and I know there's still a few people joining the room. So I'm going to start by slowly introducing myself, and then we'll get into the meat. So if you have any questions, please ask them in the chat. That's under my agenda, workshop roundtable, and there's a chat button. I will do my best to answer the questions as we go through. If I don't get your question, please drop me a message, LinkedIn, email, or I think you can arrange a one-to-one through this tool as well. More than happy to discuss, debate, having a conversation around this. So just in the interest of time, I'm gonna get going. Before I start, can anyone write in the chat to check you can hear me? I've only had one presentation where I was speaking for 10 minutes and didn't hear it, and no one could hear me. So if you could go to the chat and just confirm, that would be great. So governing cats, because they always like to run off. Who am I? Well, I'm an IBM Master Inventor. I am also an IBM Senior Technical Staff Member, or STSM, as of a few weeks ago. I'm considered an API guru, especially around governance by the sales team and field teams here at IBM. I work in a field-facing role, so I travel to clients who generally are having issues or have very complicated requests. And I look at how they're using our systems or how they can use our systems and how we can work with them to get the best out of it and get the minimum number of pain points. I mean, the dream is always zero, but there's always the political frictions in every organization we work in. Awesome, guys. Thank you for confirming you can hear me. Paranoia of a presenter. I've been at IBM 14.5 years. I've done 12.5 years in integration. I have a blog where I put sort of points of views, tips and tricks for using some of the IBM products. LinkedIn I use quite a lot. Twitter I probably tweet twice a year, so that's less useful. But if you know the API Connect product, you probably know about the deployment white paper, which I'm the primary author of for the last 2 releases of it. So here's some examples of some of the stuff I blog about: governance, pipelines, different types of APIs, how to do a chatbot with our product, and things like that. So I'm going to start off with some initial questions, and I do invite people to jump in on the chat and put their answers in here, and I'll try and tab between the slides and the web browser. So first of all, what is governance really? And I'll start off by answering this one. Firstly, it's ownership. It's understanding who is responsible for supporting and enhancing stuff. When something goes wrong, who is the control point? Who is the go-to person? You don't want a scenario where something falls over, your business is losing money, but you don't know who is responsible. So it's having a clear ownership. Certification, having the same set of rules for all of your APIs. And but not just having the rules, making sure they're enforced, because rules that are not policed do not exist. You want to have a way to ensure that all your APIs follow the same standards, the same approach, and so that when someone new comes on board or your development team rolls over, because developers and people always want to change jobs, they can come on and quickly get up to speed with all of your APIs and not have to learn each one independently. Standards, ensuring consistency. So having detailed standards, clearly identifying their purposes, but not just for the sake of standards, having them for good reason. So why do we care about governance? And I always have an hour about this phrasing of this question. And the reason I say why do we care is the number of times I have been to a client, and I think my favorite one was an Italian client who went, "We're Italian, we don't do governance." And well, they had done by the time we finished that project. Because if you don't understand what you have, how do you maintain it? How do you size it? How do you plan ahead? If you don't have a controlled pipeline coming through, how do you understand the consequences of things going wrong? How do you understand it? Which areas have the responsibility? Which areas are overloaded? Which areas need additional resourcing? Where is the breaking point? Which points are going to break first? And it's all easy to say, oh, we can worry about that as we go. And that's how most people do it. But then if you don't worry about who's going to be overloaded until you've broken, then it's too late. How do you ensure you have reuse and consistency? How do you ensure that you are bringing in, sorry, how do you ensure that you're not duplicating effort? You have two completely separated API development teams on a shared platform that essentially are building the same APIs. One client I went to said, we've just inherited all of our organization's APIs. We've inherited 1,300 APIs. We think 70 of them are all about getting account details. And they were trying to work out why and what's the history for 70 of these APIs to do essentially a very similar function in 70 different ways. And the challenge you have is once people are using your APIs, it's really hard to change them. It's really hard to modify the interface because then you're breaking your consumers. And that's one of the biggest no-nos. Why am I building an API platform? And I always come back to this point again, because you have to understand, why are you being funded? If you don't know why you're being funded, how can you be successful? So the most common reasons we have for building an API platform: building APIs provide and track function to a wider audience. So essentially you have some data or function you want to expose and you want to get it to a bigger audience. Perfectly through a combined interface. Very good reason to do it. One of the most common ones. The second most common ones is making it easier for the audience to come and consume them and removing the overhead for your APIs. This is the second reason why people are building an API platform. And the third reason is, and this is way more common than I would be comfortable with, is our business told us to do it. And when we say because someone told me to, this means so a business person has made a technical decision to build an API platform without explaining the business metrics or the business reason why this investment is. It's just being done because APIs are sexy and they want to be seen to be at the front. But if you do it just for that reason, you kind of miss the point, and you need to understand and sort of have clear goals for why we're doing this. Oops. Wrong window. So that's sort of the introduction of what I'm going to be talking about today. And I'm not going to go through a number of topics here. I'm going to go through ownership, designer certification, environments, and a few other pieces. So again, please just shout out your questions as we go. No problem at all. Just seeing who we have on the view in the session quick. Okay. So API designer certification. Rule 1. Whether you're developing a new API platform or you're bringing existing APIs to a single platform, you would need as much consistency as possible. And the phrase I prefer is consistency is king, but I was told to use the word key. If you are building a new set of APIs, if you base them all off the same data model, the same design pattern, the same principles, I don't care what those principles are, really. Providing those same principles are followed for everything, it means when you have your consumers consuming your APIs, once they've learned how to consume the first one, the second, third, and fourth each become easier because they are used to the data model. They are used to the approach. You have this canonical data model in there that is designed to facilitate your consumers as possible. However, if you have one API that uses JSON, that has a large payload going through it, and then a second API that uses XML that has a completely different data payload going through it, yet they're essentially trying to access the same sort of information, you're raising the complexity for your consumers. And if we don't have consumers, the API platform has little value. And so you need to lower that barrier of complexity as much as possible. And consistency is the easiest way of doing that. Now, of course, if you're bringing many APIs in from multiple locations and bringing them together to expose, you've then got to understand which APIs do we rewrite to be consistent? Where do we take the risk and have different styles of APIs because they're legacy? And this is where it gets very complicated. But the way I would always position this to the clients I talk to is you should always encourage that the 90% of the APIs, so there's normally only 3 or 4 APIs that represent 80 to 90% of the traffic, and start modifying or reversioning and put a new version out of those that you follow your consistent strategy, and encouraging and give incentives for your consumers to move to this new system, whether it being simpler, whether it being more coherent, whether you're adding additional functionality that they are requesting. But you only have this complicated change once or twice in the history of the platform, because if you have it too often, you lose trust. So consistency. So you want a consistent data model schema. You want a consistent approach to how you do operations and paths. Do you want the verb in the path? Do you want to have the operation name? Do you want to take parameters in the path, or do you only want to take parameters in the body, or do you want query strings? Do you want grouping? So when we publish as a product, do we group API? You should be grouping your APIs as a single sort of function in my mind. I recommend use case-based products because then they fit the term product better. And naming conventions, the API 9, the version, the path names, the data model names, have it consistent, have a pattern that people recognize. If you start having, say, some are version 1, version 2, some are version 1.1, 1.3, some are version Gemini, you're going to create confusion. You want people to be able to quickly learn and understand how all this fits together. Rule 2, think about consumption, or think about the consumer. So I am just going backwards, forwards to the chat. Think about the consumption. So often now, when we build APIs, we think about the data we are exposing so we can quickly get something out there to be used. And that's fine for some use cases, but that only really works when you understand who your consumer is. And that may be true for today, but as you grow, you may add additional consumers. You may grow to a wider audience who don't have all the background and understanding. And the goal should always be to allow 99% of your consumers to start using an API without direct connection to the team building the API. Your team building APIs should not have to spend a large proportion of their job. They will probably have to do some helping to enable their consumers. We should disconnect that as much as possible so the team building the APIs can focus on the APIs. And the team consuming the APIs can be self-sufficient or have all the information they need, and to get them up to speed as quickly as possible. Now, 99% is a lofty goal, and I don't think many people have got that high, but it's the starting point. So it's a simple thing like, is your API documented? Are you documenting your Swagger specification? Are all aspects documented? Is the documentation in the correct target language? So for example, if you are building a Spanish for, say, a API for the Spanish government, and their target audience is Spanish, is the Spanish speaking, do you have the documentation in Spanish and English, or just Spanish? Is the documentation correct? How many times have we seen APIs that have gone through 2 or 3 revisions and the documentation hasn't been updated, so it is now incorrect, and this upsets the consumers and delays them or makes them lose faith? And most importantly, is the documentation actually available? Just by having the API documented in the Swagger spec is great, but if you don't make that Swagger spec or that documentation available, does it have any value? And the number of times I sit there and I argue with organizations saying, you need a developer portal. And they go, but we're only exposing APIs internally. And I went, I don't give up. I don't care. You need to expose a developer portal still, so you have that location to go and find it. You can make, they are still consumers. They still need to have the same sort of tools to understand how to do it. Just because they can ping the API development team does not mean they should. And are there examples? And one of them, I don't want to talk about our products so much, but one of the things that our consumers always seem to like is they have an ability inside the developer portal to actually test out an API call. So they can quickly validate, is it the product, is it the API provider that's the problem, or is it their application that's the problem? And this can draw a clean line in the sand to understand where the issue lies, and really helps with this working together to fix problems. So, certifications. Now, certifications, some people consider a dirty word, some people consider it a vague word. What I mean by certifications is understanding the testing or criteria, or what are the check boxes that must be ticked for APIs to be made public. And people don't like certifications for a number of reasons. They don't like them because traditionally it requires a human and a governance board to sit down and go through the API, to go through, does it meet these requirements? Is it in French? Does it have 17,000 lines, or whatever the artificial requirements that are required? And these certifications do control in important places. They help keep you managing things, but they should not be seen as a cost. They should not be seen as an inconvenience. They should be seen as an enhancement of quality. And so in order to do that, one of the things I always recommend is you automate as much of this as possible. And we're going to talk about linting a little bit later. So that's checking the content of the API specification. But also, you need to have clear, simple rules. And I go to some banks and go, yes, we've got 16 versioning standards. So which one are we doing? We haven't decided, so we're going to write our own. This should be beyond the scope of the API platform. You need to have a clear, simple, single document of what are the rules that must be followed. Not 40 pages, 1 page, half a page ideally. A tick list, essentially, of saying, this is what the API must do. So the developers have a chance in hell of reading it. Because they're not going to want to read it. They want to write code and create function and do something interesting and exciting. Governance is exciting to people like me, but for most people, it's seen as inconvenience, and therefore we need to make this as simple as possible for people to want to do and get on board with it. Rules must be policeable. If you have any rule that is not policeable, it will not be followed. Rules must be simple, clear, and justified. If you can't explain why a rule is there, it should not be there. And we always need a manual exception process. There's always going to be that time where, oh, the CEO needs this out tomorrow, or we have a 0-day patch and we haven't got time to do all the documentation, or blah, 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 blah. There's always going to be reason for an exception. And you need that exception. That I call it the pressure release valve for when you need to just get it through quicker. But if your exception process is used more than 25% of the time, you need to go back and look at the original rules. Why are there so many exceptions? Why can the process not be followed? There may be a valid reason. But if you don't go back and look, everything will eventually become an exception. And if everything becomes an exception, you have no certification. Sample certification steps that I've recommended before. Manually check for duplications of function. So look at the APIs, look at the paths, see if there are any other APIs that have identical paths, anything that takes similar payloads. Now, there are, again, maybe good reasons for it, but this is a simple automated check you can do. Does it meet the specification? Is it a valid API? Does it validly meet the open API spec? You'll be amazed at how many APIs we see out there where they go, well, it doesn't quite meet the spec. We've adapted it this way, which breaks the spec. But then if we don't follow in the spec, what's the point of having the spec? If there's a good reason, allow it, but understand it. So that's the first section of sort of certifications. Does anyone have any questions at this point before we move on? I'm going to have to pick up the pace a little bit. Wow, we've got 16 people watching. Okay then, API lifecycle and versioning. Now, this is kind of where I got into governance back in many years ago. And the question I always like to ask our consumers, I am going to encourage people to answer this question that I put on the screen in the chat. It's how many versions of an API should be available to new consumers at the same time? So you're a new consumer, You have an API that has multiple versions. How many should there be? Simon says 3. 3 is a great answer. Any other answers? 1. That one is the purest answer. So let's move on. The wrong answer is as many as are needed. And I think Joe has got the right answer, possibly by a process of elimination. My answer is 2. But my actual answer is 2-ish. Because there's always exceptions, there's always reasons, but you should aim for no more than 2 versions of the same API live. I have gone to one client that when I walked in had 75 versions of the same API live because they didn't know who was using it and so didn't want to decommission it. And this is pre-API, this is back in SOA days. And when I left, I think they got rid of half of them because they were worried about a 0-day exploit coming through that I have to then go and fix all 75 of them. Yes, almost. I would say we'll come on. I'm going to tell you why I disagree in a second for that one. So let's talk through the API lifecycle. Well, let's talk for versioning first. Versioning numbers. I don't care how you do your versioning numbers. I only care that you're consistent. So some great examples at the top. You have 0 dot version numbers, 1 dot, 3 dot, 2 dot, 3 dot, 2 and a timestamp, all valid version numbers. Unicorn, banana, cheese. That's how you want to version your APIs. As long as you're consistent and you explain what a unicorn, what a banana, and the cheese is, happy. Don't ask your daughter for 3 random words with writing slides. Call it whatever you want, as long as you are consistent across all of your APIs, not just that API version, across all of your APIs. So the rules I always follow is each part of a version must have a clear justified purpose. How many times do we see APIs that are 1.x where that first one never gets changed? There must be no circumstances where 2 APIs have the same version but are different in any way, including documentation. No matter what the change is, that should be considered a version revision. Now, that may be why you have a 2 or a 3 dot approach. Version numbers must not change during the life cycle, i.e. once you start developing 1.1, if that version number has to be changed to be version 3, it has to go back to the start of the life cycle. And it should not be possible it must be possible, I'm going as far as saying, to describe the standard in less than half a page. You must be able to explain your version strategy in half a page. I'm always given a 60-page document to explain how this company does versioning, or 5 60-page documents. No one's going to read that. I mean, it's great to have. It's good someone's thought about it, but you should be able to get the meat of it, or what the purpose of this, in half a page. And everything must follow these standards, with the exception process as stated in the previous section. So now let's walk through a sort of API version lifecycle. And there's 2 general ways of building APIs. You do a design first approach, or you do a code first approach, where either you create the spec and then the code is written, or the code is written, you export the spec and update it. Don't care which one of these you do. That's another 2-hour beer-long conversation, which is the right way of doing this. There is no right or wrong. They're both valid approaches. You take this, it gets deployed to a test, it goes through a test process, and then it gets deployed into production. And this is where we really care for this. So before, they said you should have 2 APIs available to your audience. Now, you've said 1 in production, 1 in testing. Now, I would not personally expose APIs to my consumers unless they are production. I would not expose testing APIs. Now, I know there are different trains of thoughts here, and then this comes into the gray area of what is production, what is not production. But even if it is a proposed future spec, I would consider that a production API. But when I said before that you should have 2 versions enabled, I'm saying you should have your live, which is your current best, and you should have your superseded, your previous best. And so the live this is the version that all new users should be using. And this is a should, not a must. The reason this is a should is if you are developing a new application and then the new version has come out with an interface change, there are reasons then to allow them to use superseded. So this version, the ones that are considered superseded can still be used for new consumers, but it's discouraged. And then deprecated APIs. Deprecated APIs are still available to be consumed, but no consumer can start using an API that is deprecated. So the API developers or the API consumers will be able to see in your developer portal the live and the superseded, but they would not be able to see the deprecated ones. But if anyone's using the deprecated ones, fine, but it's still valid. They should be trying to get off it. And then finally, it goes to retired. So what does that actually mean? So we have version 1 as live. Congratulations, you've released the first version of your API. Version 2 goes through test. Now we want to enable version 2. So when version 2 goes into live, version 1 goes into superseded. This means anyone coming on board should start using version 2, but just have access to version 1 if there is a reason. When version 3 comes in, version 3 and version 2 are enabled live. Anyone using version 1 is not broken. The API is still available. But then version 4 comes in. We now have 2 that are deprecated. And this is where most people get into the message here is you end up with all your APIs in the deprecated state because people are scared to go from deprecated to retired because it could potentially break their consumers. But part of the contract, the social contract you need to have with your consumers is they will move off a deprecated API within a certain time period. I like to say 3 months. Some people like to say 2 years. Months is better than years. But you need to make sure they're aware that they need to keep this moving. And it all comes down to how frequently you're publishing new versions of the same API. And with these API versions here, I am describing an interface change here. So there is a reason for the change. It may be modified, it may be non-backwards compatible, it may be backwards compatible. But the key thing here is they need to modify how their subscriptions work to ensure they're invoking the correct version. And then after a certain time period, the API goes off and so on. And it may well be that version 2 is deprecated, so it's retired before version 1 because the version 2 consumers have got their shit together quicker, got organized quicker. And so then no one is using it, so you can safely deprecate that quicker. So any questions on the API versioning? Does that make sense? Anyone fundamentally disagree and say with what I've said? Awesome. I want to go into, no, just love it, thanks. Joa, when you say 1 for special occasions, I just want to clarify, when you say special occasions, the phrase I use is CEO's pet project, because there's always a pet project that gets in the way and breaks everything. But yeah, and at the end of the day, they provide the funding. So unit testing of API schemas. Now, there are other sessions on I think later today on linting by non-IBMers. Linting is something I've now been talking about for coming up to 2 years. And linting is a very simple, just parsing the specification, and its first incarnation is just parsing to check the spec is valid. But then this has been growing now, and you can use things like Spectral to do custom validation of your API specifications. So you could check, are descriptions being set? Are examples being set? Does the path meet the need? Do we have any banned words? I think one of my favorite one is when we had one client accidentally had a 4-letter word starting with an F as part of the path because English wasn't their first language and it was a financial user something. I'll let you guess the other 2 letters. And so they abbreviated it to the 4-letter word into the path. That was an interesting breaking change they had to handle. So the common question is, how do we ensure that our APIs follow our standards? How do we ensure that our specifications are valid? How do we ensure examples are configured? How do we ensure descriptions are configured? Any customer who I see who doesn't have descriptions and examples has to explain to me why they do not in their specification. Some customers like me, some customers accept me, some customers tolerate me. But the fact is, I ask these difficult questions because I can go and I can literally point at this saying, By having the description, by having the examples, you are saving your consumers this much time. And so the way I would recommend we do this is IBM has an open API validator. This is open source software, get it from GitHub. It's not connected to any of the API Connect products, not an API Connect customer, that's fine, you can still go and use this. It's launched under the Apache license. I should probably go and double check if the Apache license has changed, but this is how it was a year ago. And it has many key features. So it can validate Open API 2 and 3, has custom validation rules, as I described. You can modify the warnings or errors. So you could say if it doesn't have a description, it's an error, but if it doesn't have an example, it's a warning. And it works very simple like this. You have your API specification document. You have your Open API validator, which I think is a Node.js application. And then somewhere you have your config for it. And that config will sit in Git and it's part of your source control. So every time you adapt to or change your rules, you will control that in Git. And then as part of your build pipeline for publishing or deploying your APIs, you would pull in the config and the API into the validator. It will do its magic and report errors or warnings. Now, this could fail the build pipeline, or it could just send the warnings to developers and still allow it to go through. I'm a fan of it failing, but I'm not the one trying to deliver change. So in terms of the build pipeline stages, the way we'd look at this, you have your first build where you check out your YAML file, your Open API spec, could be JSON. You update environmental variables in it. So I'm very much a fan of when you have environment-based variables, you set them as part into the YAML as part of the build process. You don't use environmental variables as part of the build API platforms. But again, another big conversation. Then you go through this linting. So you go through, you apply this same configuration file. You get the answer. Does it fulfill the standards? Does it meet? Are we policing all the correct certifications? And that should take a few seconds to run. Then we deploy it. And then finally, we will do unit testing and do sanity testing. And that is what the deployment part of your build pipe should be. And linting is one of the core steps in there, because we should not be publishing invalid specifications or specifications that do not follow our own certifications. So just doing a time check, right? We've got plenty of time. So the first half I did very slowly here, and I've sped up a little bit for the last few, so I'll slow down again. So environment segregation, again, a topic that everyone thinks is very easy. And so let me give you what I call the environment dilemma. And development teams want their own environment so they do not interfere with each other. So if my team is building an API, I don't want Bob's team round the corner to come on board and do something that's going to accidentally delete my APIs. I want to mitigate that risk. So fair enough, they want their own environment. However, when we publish our environments, we want APIs from all the teams to be exposed from a single environment. So this means, and this is sort of complete polar opposites. And I've seen very, very passionate debates from both sides here on why this is fun. I mean, if I just ask anyone, if you want to put in the chat, have you seen this debate before? Excuse to tax documents should allow morals and finance such dependence. Okay, I'm just going to move on for that one. But so the key thing here is you have from each, so the operations team would like everything to be done in a single environment. So we are doing contamination testing, i.e., if these two APIs are being released in the same catalog, is it going to break something? Have we, more than once, I have seen two different development teams publish APIs with the same path, and the path is a completely sensible path for their development team or their development area. And they never occurred to them someone else would want the same path. And so when you then publish web APIs in the same catalog or the same environment point, they are then interfere with each other because there's a duplicate path. So many times. Glad to see I'm not the only one. So how do you get around this? And this is the proposal I've put to a number of clients, and most of them are accepting of it. Some of them say we have too many developer teams, and that's another thing. But it's you give each development team its own development sandbox. Now, we're not talking an entire API platform. We're talking the own isolated part of an existing platform. So because most API platforms are much wider. So in terms of some like Kubernetes world, I'll give them each their own namespace. But then as you go through, they all, as soon as they finish their development, they will go into a shared UAT or shared namespace. So this is where they may still be the team doing the testing here, but they are testing alongside all the other APIs that are currently in production and all the other APIs that are currently en route to production. So you're getting this contamination testing done early. And then you may want to go via perf, you may want to go direct to prod, don't care. Follow your processes that make sense. I would always encourage performance testing for everything. I don't live in the real world. I live in the world of infinite time and money. So some people obviously can't afford to performance test everything. So the dev teams have their own environments. They're in charge of it. They control onboarding, and they can use their environment however they want to use it. It is their baby. UAT, perf, and prod are shared environments. These have a strict set of rules that developers that must be followed. If the developers are using these environments to test them themselves, they must accept these rules and use it. And there's no way around it. So this, on the whole, makes development teams happy because they have their own playground. They onboard people at will. They can, any obstacles they can get rid of straight away. They don't have to go through security for a complex onboarding if the security controls allow them. They can control the onboarding themselves. But as soon as you start having to play nicely for others, the rules are there to be followed. And finally, we're going to move on to ownership. Ownership sound, again, like everything else I've said here today, sounds simple. The team supporting the API platform require all APIs to have a clear owner with contact information. So normally, your API development team is not necessarily the same team who will be the first people to be phoned up in the event of an outage. Normally, in my experience, it goes to an operations team who are in charge of the infrastructure, who then call in the developers who are on call to fix the problem. Though frequently, it is not necessarily clear who the contact point is for them to call. And we should be putting this as at least which team it is into the API specification. If not, and then that should then be able to be cross-referenced to find out who the contact point is for that out-of-hours call. Who gets the 2 a.m. on call check? But we need to have a way of ensuring that contact information is there. And I believe that should be in the API specification. So if a new operations person comes on board, they don't have to learn 70 different tables to look up. They can just go, this is the finance team. The finance team contact number in this spreadsheet is X, page them out, get them on board. Clearly state which team is providing support with contact information. Okay, that's what I've just said. Owner and support. But from a consumer's perspective here, so the consumer also needs a clear communication channel. Okay, I'm Chris, I work in the garage, I have my own environment which I hack around with, I'm a home labber, I want to start using your APIs to do something to make my life more interesting at home. So I try and use your APIs. How do I get help? Or I work for a large multinational company and I'm using your APIs in order for us to increase our business-to-business transactions. They don't work. Now, I don't know if this is my fault or your fault. How do I get help? The developer portal should be one of the key ways of getting of linking people together via its online forum. And I've argued this for the last 4 years. And I've had one customer use it. But you need to have that communication channel. It has to be some way for your consumers to go and get requests. And I know I said at the start that the aim is for 99% of your consumers not to need help. But that 1% person, maybe the multi-billion-dollar business who wants to give you 100 million to use your APIs. How do they go and get support? How do they work with you? So in summary from what I've covered today, governance is essential to maintain a large estate. There is no one-size-fits-all rules or processes. Everyone needs their own personalized approach that meets your corporate objectives and the talent and structure of your organization. I'm not going to come here and say, these are the 5 rules you must follow, because in my experience, not a single customer will be able to meet those 5 generic rules. But you need to be prepared to have a process that you can adapt and optimize occasionally. And the key thing here is occasionally. You shouldn't be changing this every week, but maybe every 6 months, and I'm worried the lights are about to go off in this room. So you can understand what is being used and the right way of doing it. And remember, consistency and communication. You need communication so to allow understanding and get the help when you need it, and you need consistency to avoid that, to avoid people asking for help. So you can quickly self-learn and move yourself forward. So we've got about 10 minutes left of the session. Does anyone have any questions? So I'm glad to see Max was saying, you were saying in the other session, you need a user group, free, fairly anonymous forum, a possibility to know with whom to grow the API forest. Yes. And I'll be honest, that's one of my failings in the last few years, is getting corporations to agree with me. I'm working on it still. I've not given up yet because I still think it makes sense. How does something like Workday, where version 7 of an API from 10 years ago is still alive, as well as version 40 today? Thanks, Simon. Matt's got a great question. How do I feel like where you have organizations that have version 7 and version 40 still available? So, Matt, I don't know Workday's APIs, but my question for you is this. Do they still have versions 8 to 39 available? Or is it just version 7 and version 40? I fear for them if they have to suddenly make a key change. I would encourage, I would need to look at it exactly why, but my challenge to them would be, how are you maintaining 33 versions of the same API? What is the cost there? What's the overhead? Why can they not move down? Now, if it was just version 7 and version 40, I could be exception there. Version 7 is there because that's when 90% of the business probably is. And version 40 is there because they're trying to get people to move to it. Yeah, I don't like the idea of having that many fields either, because it just means it's harder to understand it. Now, again, there's always good reasons for this, but you need to look at how the point of an API is to make the consumer's job as easy as possible in some ways to consume the data. And so they would need to understand what is the common patterns. And maybe there is a valid reason for 1,000 fields, but I still have to validate more than 20 fields in most scenarios. Yeah, people don't like change. Right, I'm not going I'm not going to comment on proto buffers because I don't know enough about them. But GraphQL, this is my opinion. This is not the opinion of IPM I'm about to say. But the issue I have with the generation of APIs, and I have this conversation internally and again with lots of clients, is they're a nice idea on theory, but the challenge you have is if the specification is not including documentation or understanding, then you're missing a trick here. Now, generation is fine to get you halfway, 3/4 of the way, get you over the starting line. But I've literally met one client who went, we now have 1,200 APIs from 6 on Friday because we redefined what an API was. And for me, that's the same as just using generation to generate this stuff. And I mean, as a coder back in my day, generation was brilliant because it made my life easier. I didn't have to write documentation. But you're missing the trick. The documentation is needed generally to help consume. Unless you have a very simple API with one purpose, generation does often bring in things like examples, but you need to have that. Description and understanding and education on why you should use it if it's the right API and not just the samples. I would honestly, I would say often it is used as a part of the trick. Now, I'm not going to say always, because if you're just exposing it internally where your consumers are already educated and you're not expecting to change your audience, then it's absolutely fine. But if you're trying to expose it to a wider, newer audience, that's when I get concerned that it's not the win people think it is. regarding GraphQL and protobufers, there's no reason you can't add additional document, and there are other ways of generating schemas as well. Now, that being said, everything costs time and money, and if they decide that it's not worth the money to put that in there, that's a business decision that I'm not going to comment on. But from a technologist, I would encourage it to get this sort of description and make it as consumable as possible. Again, that is very much my opinion here. I want to be very clear here. If you may talk to other parts of IBM who have a different view. Anything else? Well, guys, thank you so much for listening. Feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn, drop us an email, or through the many buttons that we have here. I'm about to release an article on my point of view on monetization, APIs and monetizations, probably later today. Thanks. I'm glad you enjoyed the session. I'm presenting tomorrow, and my mind has gone blank on what. I'm presenting tomorrow at a similar time. And I will be, so please come along. It's more, in some ways, it's a little bit more concise version of what we've been through here. My session tomorrow is on how good are your APIs really, and going through how we measure the success and all that good stuff, because it is, just put my blog in here. And it's all about measuring success and how you understand if your APIs are good or not by your own metrics. Matt, I'm pretty sure you are an AI. You're asking such good questions. You're just trying to masquerade as a human. So hopefully I'll see some of you at my session tomorrow on how good are your APIs really. Much shorter session, but covering sort of the success criteria and looking at what makes you successful. So everyone, have a great day. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Look out for Dan Temkin's session on multi-form APIs. I'll be in the audience. Try not to heckle too much. Dan and I have a good relationship. And also look out for Alex Butcher's session. I think it's later today on automated test generation. I think you guys will find that interesting given the conversation we've had here in the chat. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day, and speak to you tomorrow.